Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 31st of January 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comments. Coming up in the show, Medal of Honor franchise is no longer part of EA's rotation. Nvidia signs on Bohemia for the Project Shield and an Arma game by the name of Arma Tactics. Monaco creator believes that Kickstarter stretch goals are, quote, total bullshit. We'll have the analysis of that a little bit later on. And Xfire to launch Battleground, a new competitive gaming hub service. According to EA's Chief of Operations Peter Moore, the Medal of Honor franchise is no longer part of EA's regular game rotation. Mr. Moore said that the game was solid, but the focus on combat authenticity did not resonate with customers. He went on to say that the game is behind us now and they're taking Medal of Honor out of the rotation and have a plan to bring year-over-year continuity to our shooter offerings. This would indicate, of course, since Medal of Honor was one of three major shooter franchises from EA, the other two being Battlefield and Crysis, that it's most likely that the year-to-year will now be covered by the Battlefield franchise, which is most likely pretty bad news for some people that did not want Battlefield to be turned into a year-on-year Call of Duty style format. I also find it rather annoying that Mr. Moore is unwilling to take ownership of the fact that Medal of Honor was not in fact too authentic for consumers to handle. It's absolute nonsense. It's more of a case that Medal of Honor just wasn't a very good shooter. It had lackluster multiplayer. Its single player was one of the gross examples of all the horrible cliches and tropes of the MMS genre. Modern military shooter, the heavily scripted, pseudo-realistic nonsense that's been peddled to us over the past few years in single-player campaigns. You know things are getting bad when Call of Duty tries to actually break away from that formula. Even those guys over at Activision realize we need to change our formula because people are getting really bored of it. Medal of Honor came along at a terrible time, and it was a dinosaur out of the very gate, and it wasn't even a very good dinosaur. If it was a decent campaign, people would have probably forgiven it, but it wasn't. It was so much scripted nonsense. You were on rails for the entire time. Not only that, but they attempted to depict the other side of the conflict and did so in such a flat, one-dimensional, and quite frankly offensive manner that the whole thing fell apart. This is not the gritty and authentic reality of war. This is a case of we have faceless terrorist bad guys that have apparently no motivation whatsoever other than being crazy, and you're forced to play them in order to progress. And this is not what I wanted to see from that. That was a golden opportunity to take a really hard look at the motivations of jihadists and the Muslim extremists and just say, hang on a second, it's not really all about just they are crazy. That's a cop-out. That's far too easy. There was an opportunity, and they completely and totally failed to actually grip that by the horns and really take on a very difficult issue. And as a result, they just shouldn't have done it at all. It became a game about shooting brown people, and the brown people were not remotely likable, they weren't remotely relatable in any way, so they were just nothing short of targets. And when you turn those people into complete and total monsters, what do you expect people to do? It just becomes a shooting gallery to deal with that. I just wish they would take responsibility for that, and just think about what it would take to make that genre interesting again. If Call of Duty can do it with Black Ops 2, then you can totally do it with Medal of Honor. I mean, there's really no expectations on that series anymore. The World War II phase of Medal of Honor, when it was in its prime, is long past. You could reinvent that very easily, but they just developed worse games. The original Medal of Honor in 2010 wasn't any good either, especially not in terms of the single-player campaign. It's unfortunate, and I have this feeling that Battlefield is about to get the crap milked out of it, and that's a real shame, because that is a series I used to enjoy an awful lot, and unfortunately it seems like with Battlefield 4, that's the direction it's going in. Oh god, it's depressing. Here's hoping Crysis 3 ends up being pretty decent, although even if it does sell well, that's a bit risky, because I expect EA to turn around and say, right, we need 5 more of these. Nvidia have announced that they are working with Bohemia Interactive to develop a version of Arma for their forthcoming Android-based handheld system, Project Shield. It was announced today that a spin-off of the series by the name of Arma Tactics will be released for the system in the second half of 2013. This will be exclusive to the Project Shield and will be a turn-based strategy title along the lines of Jagged Alliance and XCOM. It will feature randomized missions and objectives, as well as story-driven gameplay using the touchscreen and the gamepad controls. Now, this is pretty good news as far as I'm concerned. And the reason it's good news is because it's a little bit of vindication of what I was hoping for with the Project Shield, the Ouya, the Game Stick, or whatever it's called, and any other effort that takes Android further down the road of proper games as opposed to touch-centric, 2-minute time fillers. This is the kind of game that I want to see on any platform that I own. A nice, strategic, turn-based game like that. That's legitimate. That is a legitimate gaming experience. I want Android to be able to do that because I want more competition in the marketplace for real games. I don't necessarily want the PC to be the exclusive platform. I might be a PC-centric channel, but it's in our best interests that we have a lot of competition when it comes down to making real games, when it comes down to making stuff with substance. That means that it pushes everyone else to work harder in order to try and compete with that. Nobody wants the dominance of iOS, unless, of course, you happen to be Apple or an Apple fanboy, right? iOS games, for the most part, are fairly flighty, fairly shallow experiences. There are exceptions, but you are generally not rewarded as a developer for creating those exceptions. It's not to say the game will be any good, it might be absolutely dreadful. Bohemia doesn't exactly have a lot of experience when it comes to developing turn-based tactical battle games, but hey, I'll take it. I'll see how it turns out, and hopefully it works out well for them. It does always make me very interested to see developers actually taking a risk on hardware like this, not having any idea how many units the thing will shift. This is looking to be exclusive to the Shield itself. I have to wonder if later on they might do a PC version, because that would make more sense for their usual target demographic. I have to imagine that they've either been convinced by Nvidia or maybe even subsidized by them in order to create content which becomes a system mover, right? You're not going to pick up a Shield unless you know that there's going to be games that you're interested on them. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 when trying to get devs to do that, because they don't want to make games for a system that nobody owns. Nobody wants to own the system if there aren't any good games on it. So you generally have to have the creator of the system push first-party titles to make that happen. In this case, Nvidia, not being a game developer, are more than likely finding third-party companies that are willing to work with them and give them a little bit of a helping hand along the way. So best of luck with that. Always good to have new systems on the market. The creator of the upcoming heist game Monaco, Andy Schatz, has some interesting opinions on the subject of Kickstarter. In fact, he has gone out of his way to claim that the Kickstarter stretch goal process is little more than, quote, total bullshit. Speaking to Ben Kuchera over at the Penny Arcade Report, he described how the creation of games with variable budgets and goals was a terrible way to create a game. He justified his opinion by saying the way that you should do it is you should figure out what the game is, you figure out what the game needs, and then you should make that. If you're adding in some optional thing to incentivize people to give you money, he claims, there's a difference between allowing your fans to have an extreme amount of input in the game and letting them design the game, in the sense of, if the budget is this, then I'll do this, and if the budget is that, then I will do that. That sounds like a perfect way, he says, to make a game that's insufficiently complete or bloated. This all comes in the wake of Monaco receiving $100,000 through the Indie Fund and deciding against the Kickstarter route for that particular game. Well, it's an interesting opinion, isn't it, honestly? And it's always made me scratch my head just a little bit as to how you can do the whole stretch goal thing. And I've spoken to various developers on this subject and asked them, hang on a second, how does extra money help this happen? And does this mean that the game will be delayed? Because naturally, if you're adding more stuff to the game, then surely that's going to take more time. That's what you're paying for, right? You're paying for the time. Unless it's something very specific, like orchestral soundtrack, where you have to hire the composer and the orchestra, then extra development time is the only thing that is required in order to make these features materialize. And the answer I always got was, Well, honestly, it comes down to being able to hire more people and hire specialists to work on this in tandem with everything else. They're working on it in parallel while everything else is rolling along. So they're not actually tacking it on at the end. Kind of makes sense when you think about it. I don't necessarily agree with this guy, and the reason I don't agree with it is because feature creep is a very common thing within the industry. I feel that most developers want their game to be way more than it eventually ends up being, but they have to set a cutoff point at some point, whether it be due to expertise, whether it be due to budget, whether it be due to time. And they've got to say, enough is enough. I wanted to add all this stuff to the game, but I feel that this is a good game with this feature set, and maybe this gets added on in DLC or in a sequel or whatever, and that's that. Now, when it comes down to stretch goals, we're talking about potentially the opportunity to add more features into your game without feature creep actually becoming a problem and delaying the release. We're also talking about the ability to do things like hire better voice actors. Two recent examples of stretch goals. The orchestral soundtrack for Planetary Annihilation and the Dungeon Master voice for War for the Overworld. Yeah? It requires money to pay those people. And that's why the stretch goals existed. Will the game be perfectly fine without it? Yes. Did they think that they would necessarily have the budget? Not on the amount that they were asking for on Kickstarter, no. Could they have done without that stuff? Yes, they could have, which is why they didn't include that in the budget for the Kickstarter to begin with. There are definitely a lot of issues with Kickstarter funding, but I don't feel that stretch goals are necessarily one of them. One of the biggest issues I find is developers woefully underrepresenting how expensive a game is in order to make the goal more attainable, because as you know, if you don't pass the goal, you get none of it on Kickstarter. It is all or nothing. So what happens is they set deliberately low goals to make it easier to actually attain that, and then they add stretch goals on top of that. Now that is, of course, in my opinion, not representative of how expensive the game actually is, and I feel that that is somewhat dishonest by the developers. I discourage that kind of activity, I encourage complete transparency, and as far as I'm concerned, Kickstarter should be mandating a big list of expenses. It's got to be detailed. Why do you need $500,000? Or why are you only asking for $30,000? What is that paying for? You don't have to give me an exact number. That's fine. You can give me a ballpark, but I at least want to see a breakdown. It helps people understand where their money's going. It gives them more confidence that the developer actually knows what they're doing. And every time I see a really low goal, I naturally get suspicious because I'm thinking, I know for a fact that developers actually need to be paid. So if you're asking for $25,000 for a year's worth of development time, I have to ask how many people are on your team, and if it's any more than 2, I'll be like, where's the rest of the money coming from? And if you can't tell me that, then I'll be like, well, I'm not going to give you my money then, because I don't think that that money's actually going where you say it is. You can't pay 3+ developers on that. You can't even pay 2, really, or even 1, and maybe an indie developer would accept $25K a year. That sounds like a lot of money to some people, but it really isn't, especially considering all of the other expenses involved in actually creating the game itself. So that's my opinion on the matter. I don't feel that stretch goals are really a problem. I think there's a lot of other stuff that really needs to be addressed with Kickstarter that actually is something of an issue, but I feel that stretch goals can be tied into a wider misrepresentation of the real financial realities that are facing these developers when they put their games up on Kickstarter in the first place. And finally, Xfire, yes, it's still around, has announced that they will be launching the Battleground service, which is a new competitive gaming hub which supports multiple games and has a universal point system across the board. The service is designed to support games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Counter-Strike, with stats tracking, friend tracking, universal matchmaking, as well as hefty anti-cheat and scorekeeping software. In future, Xfire claims that they are looking to support the competitive scene with regular sponsored events and so-called battle tokens, which can be traded in for prizes in monthly sweepstakes. So, seems to be like gathering prize tickets at one of those kids' arcades. Now, currently, the service is in closed beta and only supports Call of Duty 4. Coming up, they claim Battlefield 3, Counter-Strike Source, Counter-Strike Go, the original Counter-Strike, and bizarrely Call of Duty 2, which I wasn't even aware actually had a competitive scene. The interesting thing as well is that they will actually be hosting the servers themselves and actually plugging them into the system. So this is all going to be fully supported by them. I'm just trying to figure out exactly what their angle is on this and why they're doing it, because it seems like an awful lot of money to not actually get anything back whatsoever. Do they intend to charge for these tournaments? It may be that they start to do premium tournament tickets, which would actually explain an awful lot of things, and that seems like a business model that might work. And it's certainly not terrible to start hosting servers for older games and try to re-stimulate a competitive scene. You know, I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a Battlefield 2 set of servers plugged into this thing, or a lot of older stuff. Hey, Unreal Tournament 1999, why don't we do that? Or UT2K4. That might be interesting, and Xfire seems to be one of those old-school clients that might very well be down with that. I mean, let's be honest here. Who's actually used Xfire in the last few years? It used to be the thing. It used to be an incredible thing. It had a game overlay, which of course Steam essentially took and ended up taking over from it. It had game tracking, it had time tracking, stats, all sorts of cool stuff. You could even do video streaming and capture on this thing. But lately it seems like Xfire has become significantly less worthwhile, and its services have been outmoded and outdated by other things. So we'll see how this one turns out. I think that they're in for an interesting time if they're able to support a lot of older, less popular games that actually have servers. It would be really cool to see those scenes stimulated again. Can we see a Call of Duty 2 competitive scene rise again from the ashes? Could we see Unreal Tournament rise again? It would be kind of neat if you could, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes. But obviously for me, it's a little bit weird to look at this and see all of the games on the list not really be any of the top competitive games. There's nothing there for League of Legends, there's nothing there for StarCraft 2, of course there wouldn't be, because neither of those services allow you to host servers for their games, right? So it seems like this would have to be focused on older titles that allow you to run dedicated servers, and that could mean an interesting revival of a whole lot of other crazy stuff. So let's keep an eye on it and see if it ends up being any good. It would be interesting to see if Xfire could become relevant again. Okay folks, that is me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch, and I will see you next time.